something changed the moment Donald Trump used one word: mutual. Not explosive, not dramatic, but dangerous. Because in war, the quietest word can reveal the deepest chain of command. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and support our work so we can keep bringing you sharp, honest analysis on the forces reshaping America and the world. Hello and welcome. I'm Alex. For years, I've studied the intersection of economics and politics, and today, we break down what's shaping our world. When Trump told the Times of Israel that the decision on when the Iran war ends would be mutual, with Benjamin Netanyahu, most people heard a routine line of coordination between allies. That is not what this was. This was a window into the real power structure behind the war. And once you see it clearly, the stakes look much bigger. That word tells us this conflict is no longer being presented as a purely American decision with Israeli input, or an Israeli campaign backed by Washington from a distance. It is being framed as a shared war at the top, a jointly managed conflict, a political-military partnership in which Netanyahu is not standing outside the room waiting for updates. He is inside the room, shaping the clock. That should stop every American cold. Because once a U.S. president publicly says the end of a war depends on a mutual decision with a foreign leader, the meaning goes far beyond diplomacy. It means American military timing is now tied to Israeli political timing. It means the cost of this war, in oil prices, market volatility, regional instability, and strategic credibility, is no longer just a function of what Washington wants. It is connected to what Netanyahu needs, what Israel fears, and what both leaders believe they can afford politically. And here is the deeper layer: Trump did not surrender control. He said the decision would be mutual, but also made clear he would decide at the right time. That is not a contradiction. That is a hierarchy. Shared ownership on the surface. Final authority at the top. In plain language, Trump wants the benefits of partnership without losing the image of command. That is a risky structure. History shows that wars become harder to end when two leaders politically own them at the same time. Why? Because war stops being only about battlefield goals. It becomes about reputation. Neither side wants to look weak. Neither side wants to blink first. Neither side wants the ending to look smaller than the promises made at the beginning. And that is where the danger grows. Because once war is fused with leadership image, every delay becomes more expensive, every strike becomes more binding, and every off-ramp starts to look like retreat. This is not just about Iran anymore. It is about how power is shared, how risk is priced, and how America gets pulled deeper into conflicts that start abroad but end up rewriting life at home. So no, mutual is not a soft diplomatic word. It is a hard strategic signal. It means this war may not end when the battlefield cools. It may end only when two leaders decide they can survive the politics of stopping. And that is a much more dangerous timeline. Trump and Netanyahu, from alliance to war management partnership. Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu are no longer standing in the familiar space of diplomatic alignment. They are operating in something tighter, riskier, and far more consequential, a political partnership built inside the machinery of war. That shift is the real story. Not simply that Washington supports Israel. Not simply that Israel trusts Washington. But that the two leaders now appear to be shaping the war in a way that binds their authority together. This matters because alliances and partnerships are not the same thing. An alliance allows room. A partnership reduces distance. In an alliance, each side keeps strategic separation, preserves its own timetable, and protects its own exit options. In a war management partnership, that space begins to disappear. Decisions become fused. signals become shared. One leader's political needs start influencing the other leader's military timing. That is where the danger deepens. Trump's own language makes the structure visible. He does not speak about Benjamin Netanyahu as a leader he merely supports. He speaks about him as a man he has worked with directly, a wartime counterpart inside the same strategic frame. That is a serious evolution. It tells us that this campaign against Iran is not just coordinated through institutions, defense channels, and diplomatic ritual. It is being personalized at the top. And once war becomes personal at the top, the logic of decision-making changes. For Benjamin Netanyahu, this arrangement is enormously valuable. It reinforces the most important asset any wartime leader can possess: indispensability. The closer he appears to Donald Trump, the harder it becomes for critics, rivals, or even uneasy allies to argue that he is politically isolated or strategically replaceable. His connection to Washington becomes more than a foreign policy advantage. It becomes part of his domestic power structure. In times of crisis, proximity to American power is not just deterrence. It is political capital. For Trump, the calculation runs in a different direction but leads to the same place. He wants to project command, decisiveness, and historical force. He wants to look like the leader who acts with clarity while others hesitate. A close operational bond with Benjamin Netanyahu helps him tell that story. It lets him frame the war not as drift, but as deliberate leadership. Not as reaction, but as strategic will. That narrative has obvious political strength, especially for an audience that rewards toughness and punishes visible uncertainty. But this is exactly where the system becomes more fragile. Because once two leaders become visibly invested in the same war, ending that war becomes harder than starting it. The question is no longer only whether military goals have been met. The question becomes whether both men can walk away without looking diminished. Can Benjamin Netanyahu afford an end that feels incomplete? Can Donald Trump afford an outcome that looks less than decisive after claiming such a high-stakes role? That is where war stops being only about force and starts being about image, legacy, and political survival. And history is blunt on this point. Shared wars often become sticky wars. Not because leaders do not understand the risks, but because they do. They know that once they attach their identity to a conflict, retreat becomes expensive. Delay becomes tempting. Escalation becomes easier to justify than ambiguity. That is why this Trump-Netanyahu relationship should be seen for what it is, not just alliance politics, but shared war ownership. And shared ownership can create unity in the opening act, while making the final act much harder to control. The Iran endgame, regime pressure, succession shock, and the rise of Mojtaba Khamenei. The most dangerous mistake in Washington right now would be to think that killing Ayatollah Ali Khamenei automatically weakened Iran in a clean, linear way. That is not how hardened regimes work. When a system like the Islamic Republic loses its supreme figure under external attack, it does not simply fall into chaos and disappear. It compresses. It hardens. It turns inward. And that is exactly why the rise of Mojtaba Khamenei matters so much. His appointment is not just a succession story. It is the regime's answer to a decapitation strike. It is the system saying, under fire, that continuity will come before reform, cohesion before openness, and survival before flexibility. That is the real endgame taking shape inside Iran. Not collapse in the dramatic Hollywood sense. Something more dangerous than that, a wounded state reorganizing itself around the logic of endurance. Mojtaba Khamenei is not emerging as a popular national unifier. He is emerging as a crisis instrument of regime continuity. That distinction is critical. He does not bring democratic legitimacy. He does not arrive with a broad social mandate. He arrives with bloodline, clerical identity, institutional proximity, and reported ties to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. In a moment like this, those are not small details. They are the entire structure of power. Because in an emergency succession, the real question is never just who inherits the title. The real question is who can hold the system together when fear starts moving through it. Who can command loyalty from security networks, ideological enforcers, military institutions, financial channels, and the inner circle that still controls the state. Mojtaba Khamenei appears to have been chosen precisely because he fits that design. He is not the regime's fresh face. He is the regime's locked door. That has major strategic consequences for the United States and Israel. A lot of outside observers instinctively assume that a leadership shock opens the path to moderation. History usually suggests the opposite. When states built on revolutionary identity and coercive power feel existentially threatened, they often shift toward more centralized, more suspicious, and more punitive forms of rule. The leadership becomes narrower. Decision-making becomes more ideological. Compromise starts looking like surrender. And there is a second danger here. Mojtaba Khamenei rises under conditions that almost force him to prove strength. He is stepping into power after the killing of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, under the shadow of war, inside a structure that now carries the stain of dynastic succession. That means he is not just managing enemies abroad. He is also managing doubts at home. He has to prove that he is not merely the son who inherited the throne, but the leader who can defend the system under maximum pressure. That kind of legitimacy problem can drive escalation. This is where the historical irony becomes sharp. The Islamic Republic was born by denouncing hereditary power. Yet now, at its most vulnerable hour, it has fallen back on lineage to preserve authority. That may stabilize the regime in the short term, but it also exposes a deep contradiction at its core. And regimes built on contradiction often become more brittle the longer they try to hide it. So the Iran endgame is not simple. It is not just about whether Tehran survives. It is about what kind of Tehran survives. And the answer taking shape now is unsettling: a state more concentrated, more defensive, more ideological, and potentially more dangerous because it believes history has cornered it. Why oil is the second battlefield and the one Americans will feel first. Oil is where this war stops being a distant headline and starts becoming an American reality. Missiles may fly over Iran and Israel, but the first shock most Americans will actually feel is not military. It is economic. It is the price of gasoline, the cost of shipping, the pressure on groceries, the nervousness in financial markets, and the slow, grinding fear that another global disruption is moving into daily life. That is why oil is the second battlefield in this conflict, and the one Americans will feel first. Too many people still treat oil as just another commodity, as if it were one market among many. It is not. Oil is the hidden layer beneath modern life. It powers transportation, supports manufacturing, shapes food distribution, influences airline pricing, affects industrial production, and drives expectations about inflation. When oil breaks upward fast, the damage does not stay in the energy sector. It spreads through the system. That is what makes this conflict so dangerous. It is not just a war over territory, deterrence, or leadership. It is a war pressing on the economic nerves of the world. The Strait of Hormuz sits at the center of that pressure. It is not just a narrow waterway on a map. It is one of the most sensitive choke points in the global economy. A major share of the world's seaborne oil and gas moves through that corridor. When that route is disrupted, or even credibly threatened, The market reacts before the full physical shortage even appears. Traders price fear. Insurers price danger. Shipping firms price delay. Governments price contingency. And from that moment on, the world is no longer buying energy under normal conditions. It is buying energy under stress. That is where Iran's leverage becomes real. Tehran does not need to defeat the United States in a conventional military sense to hurt American power. It does not need to sink the global economy outright. It only needs to make the energy system unstable enough that every major economy starts paying a premium for uncertainty. That is how weaker states impose pain on stronger ones. They do not always win by matching force. They win by targeting exposure. And in this war, exposure runs through oil. This is also why Donald Trump's comment that higher energy prices are a very small price to pay carries such weight. Politically, it is meant to signal resolve. Strategically, it tells the market something more sobering. Washington may be willing to tolerate serious economic pain in pursuit of a larger geopolitical objective. Once the market believes that, volatility gains its own momentum. Price spikes stop looking temporary. They start looking like policy-compatible risk. And that is the point Americans need to hold on to. Oil is not just reacting to war. Oil is interpreting leadership. It is reading Donald Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu, and Mojtaba Khamenei as actors whose choices can extend instability, deepen fear, and keep the risk premium alive. That is why this battlefield matters so much. It is where strategy becomes inflation, where geopolitics becomes household pressure, and where a conflict far away begins to rewrite the emotional and economic climate at home. The logic of escalation: why wars rarely end when leaders say they can control them. Wars rarely end when leaders say they can control them because war is not a speech. It is not a press line. It is not a timetable drafted in a secure room by confident men who believe force will stay inside the boundaries they designed for it. War is a living chain reaction. Once it starts, it begins changing the people who launched it, the systems around it, and the costs they thought they could manage. That is the real logic of escalation, and it is exactly why the current conflict involving Donald Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu, Iran, and now Mojtaba Khamenei has entered such dangerous territory. At the beginning of almost every war, political leaders speak the language of control. They say the mission is limited. They say the objective is clear. They say the enemy will understand the message. They say deterrence will be restored quickly. And for a brief moment, that confidence can sound persuasive, especially to a public that wants strength without chaos. But history is brutally consistent on this point. Leaders do not control wars simply because they announce that they do. They shape the opening move. After that, the war begins shaping them. That is because war is interactive. It has multiple centers of action, multiple centers of fear, and multiple layers of consequence. Donald Trump may believe he and Benjamin Netanyahu can judge the right moment to stop. But the battlefield does not answer only to Washington and Jerusalem. Iran answers. Mojtaba Khamenei answers. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps answers. Oil markets answer. Regional militias answer. Domestic political pressure answers. Public emotion answers. Even silence answers, because hesitation itself can trigger miscalculation. This is where the illusion of control begins to crack. Leaders do not merely face the enemy. They face the meaning of their own words. Trump has chosen language of strength, finality, and judgment. Benjamin Netanyahu has tied the conflict to existential stakes. Iran, after the killing of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, responded by selecting Mojtaba Khamenei and closing ranks around the harder center of power. None of these moves creates flexibility. All of them create obligation. Once leaders speak in absolute terms, they begin locking themselves into a narrower path. That narrowing is one of the most dangerous forces in international politics. In theory, leaders want options. In practice, they often destroy their own options through rhetoric. The moment a government defines a war as a test of credibility, stopping becomes politically harder than continuing. The moment a leader presents the conflict as necessary to prevent catastrophe, any compromise starts looking like weakness. And the moment an enemy frames endurance as honor or survival, retaliation becomes politically valuable even when it is strategically costly. That is why escalation is not always driven by recklessness. Often it is driven by structure. The structure of public commitments. The structure of alliance expectations. The structure of domestic politics. The structure of financial exposure. The structure of leadership ego. Once those structures harden, escalation can continue even when everyone involved understands the risks. And this is where the financial dimension becomes more important than many people realize. Wars do not escalate only through bombs and missiles. They escalate through capital, commodities, insurance, and time. The longer instability lasts, the more investors adjust. The more investors adjust, the more governments face pressure. The more governments face pressure, the more leaders become tempted to seek a visible result before stopping. In other words, financial stress does not simply punish war. It can also trap leaders deeper inside it, because no one wants to stop after paying a high price and then admit the outcome was incomplete. This is one reason escalation ladders are so dangerous. They look logical at first. Strike here. Signal there. Deter the enemy. Force recalculation. But each rung creates a new political burden. A limited strike invites a response. A response invites punishment. Punishment invites a demonstration of resilience. Resilience invites broader targeting. Broader targeting invites regional spillover. Soon, what began as an operation with boundaries becomes a contest over who is still standing after the boundaries collapse. The public often sees escalation as a series of events. One strike, then another. One speech, then another. But the deeper reality is that escalation is a psychology of entrapment. Each actor begins to fear the cost of stopping more than the cost of continuing. Donald Trump may worry that ending the war too soon would make him look hesitant after presenting himself as decisive. Benjamin Netanyahu may worry that a pause without clear strategic proof would make Israel look exposed. Mojtaba Khamenei may worry that any sign of restraint would make his early rule look fragile after inheriting power under fire. Each leader, in different ways, may feel compelled to keep moving not because the path is wise, but because the alternative feels politically humiliating. That is how wars become longer than their architects intended. Not because nobody sees the danger, but because everyone sees a different danger first. One sees the danger of retreat. Another sees the danger of appearing weak. Another sees the danger of domestic backlash. Another sees the danger of losing deterrence. By the time those fears collide, the war has already expanded beyond its original logic. History offers repeated warnings. Great powers have often mistaken initial military superiority for long-term strategic control. They assumed the enemy would absorb punishment and step back. Instead, the enemy adapted, decentralized, widened the theater, used time as leverage, or found new ways to raise the cost. The strongest actor in conventional terms is not always the actor with the most control over duration. Sometimes the weaker side controls duration precisely because it can survive disorder longer than the stronger side can tolerate it politically. That point matters enormously here. Iran does not need to dominate the battlefield to complicate the war. It needs only to deny closure. It needs to keep enough pressure alive that Washington and Jerusalem cannot easily declare a stable victory. That is the hidden power of weaker states in asymmetrical conflicts. They weaponize persistence. They turn uncertainty into leverage. They force stronger opponents to keep paying for time. And time is never neutral in war. Time changes market expectations. Time hardens political narratives. Time deepens public fatigue. Time creates pressure inside alliances. Time transforms tactical success into strategic ambiguity. This is why leaders who say they can choose the perfect moment to end a war are often speaking less as strategists, and more as politicians trying to project calm in the middle of a system they no longer fully govern. None of this means leaders are powerless. It means power in war is conditional, contested, and constantly eroding under stress. Real control is not the ability to start a conflict. Real control is the ability to stop it without triggering something worse. And that is far harder. So when Americans hear that this war can be managed, timed, or concluded at the will of top leaders, they should listen with discipline, not comfort. Because the real logic of escalation is unforgiving. Wars keep moving when leaders become prisoners of their own commitments, their own alliances, their own economic exposure, and their own fear of what stopping will say about them. That is the truth beneath the rhetoric. Wars do not end when leaders say they are in control. They end when the system forces a reckoning they can no longer outrun. The moral front, civilian deaths, strategic messaging, and the battle for legitimacy. Every war eventually reaches the same brutal test, not whether it can destroy, but whether it can still justify itself. That is where this conflict is now. Beyond the missiles, beyond the oil shock, beyond the political statements from Donald Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu, and Mojtaba Khamenei, there is another battlefield opening in full view. It is the moral front. And in modern war, that front can become just as decisive as any military one. The reason is simple. Power alone does not carry legitimacy. Firepower does not explain itself. States can claim necessity, self-defense, deterrence, or prevention, but those claims only hold if the public still believes the use of force remains bounded by some moral line. The moment civilians begin to dominate the imagery of war, the political meaning of every strike changes. It is no longer just about what was targeted. It becomes about what kind of war this really is, who is paying the human price, and whether the stated mission is still morally recognizable. That is why reports surrounding the strike on the compound tied to an Iranian girl's school matter so deeply. That is why the images of smoke over Tehran matter. That is why every scene of fear, displacement, and civilian loss matters. In war, images do not simply document events. They reorder public judgment. One photograph, one video clip, one account of dead students or wounded families can break through layers of official language and force a much more painful question: what exactly is being defended, and at what cost? This is not sentimentality. It is strategy. Because legitimacy is a form of power. It affects diplomatic room, domestic endurance, alliance cohesion, media framing, and the willingness of ordinary people to keep believing in the mission. The United States and Israel may be able to explain military necessity in technical terms. But civilians do not live inside technical terms. They live inside loss, fear, and memory. And once those images begin defining the war, the side with greater military strength can start losing political ground even while winning tactical engagements. Iran understands that dynamic. A regime under enormous pressure can use civilians suffering to reclaim political oxygen, especially if it has been hit hard at the top. Even a government with internal legitimacy problems can wrap itself in national pain and recast itself as the shield of a wounded people. That does not erase its own record. but it can change the emotional terrain. In politics, victimhood can become mobilization. In war, civilian death can become narrative fuel. For Americans, this matters in a very direct way. Public support for force is rarely destroyed only by strategic disagreement. More often, it erodes when the moral picture collapses. The public begins with a willingness to believe that power is being used for protection. But if the visible result becomes dead children, shattered civilian spaces, and a widening sense of collective punishment, then the moral language of the war starts to rot from within. And once that happens, even strong leaders lose room. That is the deeper truth of the moral front. It is not separate from strategy. It is strategy under the pressure of conscience. A government can win strikes and still lose belief. It can dominate the sky and still lose the story. And in the long run, wars that lose their moral center rarely keep their political center for long. Netanyahu's incentives, Trump's calculus, and the politics of staying the course. To understand why this war may continue longer than many people expect, you have to look past the speeches and into the incentives. Wars are not sustained by rhetoric alone. They are sustained by political need, by fear of weakness, by institutional pressure, and by the personal calculations of leaders who know that once they attach themselves to a conflict, the cost of stepping back can become as dangerous as the cost of pushing forward. That is exactly where Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu now stand. For Benjamin Netanyahu, the war is not unfolding in a political vacuum. It is unfolding in the shadow of legal pressure, domestic division, and a long-running struggle over authority inside Israel. In that environment, war does something powerful for any embattled leader. It rearranges priorities. It changes the national conversation. It pushes questions of accountability behind questions of survival. It creates a climate in which experience, toughness, and access to power become more politically valuable than ever. That does not automatically mean Netanyahu wants endless conflict. But it does mean that wartime conditions strengthen the argument that he remains indispensable. And indispensability is political currency. The closer Netanyahu stands to Donald Trump, the more he reinforces that currency. He is not just the Prime Minister of Israel. He becomes the leader with direct influence over the White House in the middle of a regional war. That matters at home because it signals reach, leverage, and strategic necessity. It tells allies and critics alike that removing him, or weakening him in the middle of the crisis carries its own risk. In politics, survival often depends less on popularity than on perceived necessity. War can increase that perception dramatically. Donald Trump, meanwhile, is operating under a different but equally powerful set of incentives. He has chosen to frame this conflict as an act of strength, judgment, and leadership. He is not positioning himself as a cautious manager dragged reluctantly into events. He is presenting himself as the man willing to do what others would not do. That gives him a strong narrative, but it also creates a trap. Once a leader defines himself through decisive action, any outcome that looks incomplete begins to carry political danger. Stopping too early can be framed as hesitation. Stopping without visible gains can be framed as weakness. And a president who has claimed historic clarity cannot easily pivot into ambiguity without paying a price. This is where the politics of staying the course becomes so dangerous. Netanyahu may need continued pressure to preserve strategic momentum and reinforce his centrality. Trump may need continued pressure to prove that his boldness produced more than headlines. Neither man thinks only in military terms. Both are also thinking in terms of image, legacy, leverage, and domestic consequence. That is why wars can become sticky. Not because leaders fail to see the risks, but because they see different political losses waiting on the other side of restraint. And here is the hardest truth. A war jointly owned at the top becomes harder to end because peace itself starts to look political. It is no longer just a military question of whether enough has been achieved. It becomes a question of whether both leaders believe they can stop without appearing smaller than the war they chose to own. That is the real politics of staying the course. And in conflicts like this, that calculation can keep the fire burning long after the first strategic objective has already been overtaken by the weight of pride, pressure, and power. What comes next? Scenarios for America, Israel, Iran, and the global economy. What comes next will not be decided by speeches alone. It will be decided by endurance, by political pain, by economic pressure, and by which system breaks first under sustained strain. That is the real horizon now for the United States, Israel, Iran, and the global economy. The next stage of this conflict will not be a clean chapter change. It will be a test of whether the forces now in motion can still be contained before they harden into a longer and far more dangerous order. For the United States, the central question is no longer simply whether Donald Trump can project strength. The real question is whether strength can remain politically sustainable once it begins colliding with economic reality. If oil stays elevated, if market volatility deepens, if inflation pressure returns, then this war stops being a foreign policy story and becomes a domestic stress test. American power is always strongest when strategy abroad and stability at home reinforce each other. But when they begin to pull in opposite directions, even the strongest posture starts to weaken. That is the risk ahead for Washington. Not instant collapse of support, but slow erosion through cost, fatigue, and the feeling that a war sold as controlled is becoming more expensive than advertised. For Israel, the next phase is about whether military momentum can be converted into strategic closure. That is much harder than it sounds. Tactical success and strategic resolution are not the same thing. Benjamin Netanyahu may be able to claim that pressure on Iran has altered the regional balance, but the deeper question is whether that pressure creates lasting security or simply opens a wider cycle of retaliation, uncertainty, and dependence on permanent escalation. A state can win strikes and still inherit instability. That is the danger for Israel if this conflict stretches into a condition of endless management instead of decisive settlement. For Iran, the future depends on how Mojtaba Khamenei transforms succession into authority. That is not automatic. In moments like this, regimes do not only fight enemies abroad. They fight doubt at home. Mojtaba Khamenei now carries the burden of proving that he is not merely the heir to Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, but a leader capable of preserving the Islamic Republic under maximum pressure. That may push him toward harder decisions, harsher symbolism, and a deeper embrace of coercive power. If that happens, Iran may emerge from this period not weaker in will, but narrower, more ideological, and more dangerous because compromise will look like surrender. And for the global economy, the biggest threat is not a dramatic one-day collapse. It is prolonged instability. That is the scenario policymakers fear most because it does not arrive like a single disaster. It arrives as a steady accumulation of strain, high oil, anxious markets, disrupted shipping, slower growth, weaker confidence, and governments forced to manage crisis after crisis without ever returning to normal. That kind of conflict drains systems quietly before it shocks them loudly. So what comes next is not just about who fires next or who speaks next. It is about whether these leaders can still recognize the line between leverage and overreach. Because history is full of powers that believed they were shaping events, only to discover too late that events were reshaping them. And that is the warning hanging over this war now. The next phase may not be the loudest, but it may be the one that decides everything. In the end, this is not just the story of Donald Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu, Mojtaba Khamenei, or the death of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. It is the story of how power behaves under pressure. Trump presents himself as the leader who acts, who refuses hesitation, and who believes strength can shape the end of war. Netanyahu appears as the wartime partner who understands that in moments of fear, political survival and national security often become tightly fused. Mojtaba Khamenei rises not as a symbol of renewal, but as the product of a system that answered shock with consolidation, bloodline, and ideological hardening. Around them, oil markets shake, civilians suffer, alliances tighten, and the world is reminded that war never stays on the battlefield for long. It moves into economies, into public psychology, into daily life. The deepest lesson from this story is simple but powerful. When leaders tie pride, legitimacy, and identity to conflict, the cost of stopping often becomes harder than the cost of starting. That lesson does not apply only to war. It applies to life. Many people stay trapped in bad decisions because they are too invested in being right. They keep going in the wrong direction because turning back feels like defeat. But real strength is not blind escalation. Real strength is knowing when pride is becoming self-destruction. In our own lives, that means learning to step back early, tell the truth early, and correct course before pressure hardens into damage. Whether in money, work, family, or relationships, the longer we ignore reality, the more expensive reality becomes. Here's a quick question for you. Do you believe wars like this are driven more by national security concerns or by the personal political calculations of leaders? A. National security comes first. B. Political survival comes first. Comment A or B below. And what is your own view on everything we discussed today? Do you think Donald Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu, and Mojtaba Khamenei are shaping history, or are they being trapped by it? Share your thoughts in the comments so everyone can read and compare perspectives. And if you want more deep, sharp analysis like this, subscribe to the channel and support it so we can keep making the next powerful video.